I need you to picture something for me. You're 38 weeks pregnant. Your ankles are so swollen you cannot fit them into anything with a back strap, so you have been wearing the same pair of foam slides for 11 days. It is a Tuesday in February, 6 in the morning, and you are on your hands and knees on the kitchen tile with a scrub brush because the grout line near the refrigerator has been bothering you for 2 weeks, and you have finally decided today is the day you fix it. Your back aches in a way that has no name. Your husband left for work at 5:15. He does that a lot, leaves early, comes home late, always with an explanation that makes complete sense when he says it and dissolves like wet paper the moment you try to hold it up to the light. You're scrubbing grout at 6 in the morning because you need to feel like you are contributing to something. Because the credit card was declined at the grocery store last week and he said it was a banking error, an algorithm glitch, nothing to worry about, and you believed him the way you had been believing him for 4 years. Because you have not worked in 7 months and you feel the specific shame of a woman who used to be competent, who used to have a salary, a title, a reason to answer emails before 8 a.m., now reduced to budgeting grocery trips and scrubbing tile while the baby kicks hard enough to shift your center of gravity. That was me, February 14th, Valentine's Day. I spent it on the kitchen floor with a scrub brush while $250,000 moved through a bank account I did not know existed. I want to tell you how I know that. I want to tell you the exact sequence of events that led me from that kitchen floor to a conference room in a law office on the 41st floor of a building in downtown Chicago, sitting across from a forensic accountant who slid a printed report across the table and said quietly, "Mrs. Calloway, this has been happening for at least 3 years." But to explain what that day in the law office meant, I have to go back to the beginning. My name is Renata Calloway. I am 41 years old. I was a supply chain operations manager for a mid-sized logistics company before I took maternity leave, and before that I spent 12 years building a career from an entry-level coordinator position up to a role that oversaw 18 people and a regional contract portfolio worth roughly $4 million annually. I say this not to impress you. I say it because the first thing people ask, the first thing women ask, specifically with that particular edge in their voice that is not quite accusation, is how you didn't know. And I want to be clear about who I was before I answer that question. I was not naive. I was not uneducated. I was not the kind of woman who handed over financial control because she didn't understand money. I understood money precisely. I had a 401k I had been contributing to since I was 24. I had reviewed contracts. I had caught billing errors that saved my company 6 figures more than once. I was, by any reasonable measure, a financially literate adult who paid attention. And I still missed it for 3 years. What I want you to understand, what took me the better part of 18 months to fully understand myself, is that financial deception at the level my husband practiced, it is not something you stumble into by being careless. It is engineered. It is constructed deliberately around the specific gaps in what you know, what you trust, and what you would never think to question. Marcus Calloway is a structural civil engineer by training and by temperament. He builds things that hold weight. And what he built for 3 years was a financial architecture so precisely designed around my blind spots that every time I got close to a real question, there was already a wall there, smooth and solid, with no place to get your fingers in. We met at a professional development conference in Atlanta. He was presenting a session on infrastructure resilience. I was there for the supply chain track, but I ended up in his session by accident. Wrong room. I stayed anyway. He was specific. He was precise. He did not use vague language when exact language was available, and in my experience, that is genuinely rare in a person. We talked at the reception afterward for 2.5 hours. We were married 14 months later. The early years of our marriage were ordinary in all the ways that matter. We had disagreements about money exactly once in the first 3 years. He wanted to buy a boat, and I said we should wait until the mortgage was under $150,000, and he agreed immediately without argument. That is the disagreements I think about now. How easy it was. How quickly he let it go. At the time, I read it as maturity, as partnership. He picked his battles. He was reasonable. Now I read it differently. He let me win the small argument because he had already won something I did not know was a competition. We bought a house in a suburb called Deerfield, 40 minutes outside Chicago, 4 bedrooms, a yard with a slope in it that I kept saying we should fix and never did. He traveled for work, consulting contracts, site assessments, meetings in cities I could name: Denver, Phoenix, Charlotte, Houston. His travel schedule had always been significant. I had never questioned it because it had always produced the income that supported the life we were living. His base salary was $230,000 a year. I knew this because I had seen the offer letter when he accepted the position 7 years ago, and because we had filed joint taxes every year since. The taxes showed his W-2 income clearly. I reviewed them. I signed them. What I did not review, what he handled entirely, what I had no reason to distrust because we had a system and the system had always worked, were the investment accounts. He managed them. That was the arrangement. Not because I couldn't, but because he offered early and I was busy, and he was meticulous, and it made sense the way 10,000 small domestic arrangements make sense when you are 2 working adults trying to run a household. He showed me statements quarterly, numbers that grew slowly, steadily, without drama. The kind of investment returns you do not question because they are not exciting enough to scrutinize. Nothing flashy. Nothing that set off any alarms. What I did not know then, what I would not know for another 3 years, was that Marcus had a second financial identity, a second LLC, a second set of accounts registered in a state we did not live in, funded by consulting income that was entirely separate from his W-2 salary, income that never appeared on a joint return because it was never reported to me, income that arrived every month in amounts ranging from $200,000 to $312,000 from a single client I had never heard him mention, $250,000 every month for 38 months. While I clipped grocery coupons, while I budgeted birthday presents, while I scrubbed grout at 6 a.m. on Valentine's Day with a baby pressing down on my pelvis and a credit card that had been declined twice in 6 weeks, and a husband who had an explanation for everything. The first crack did not appear the way you might expect. There was no dramatic moment, no confrontation, no smoking gun discovered in a coat pocket. It was something much smaller than that. It was a name I did not recognize on a cell phone screen, not a name that suggested anything romantic, not a name that set off the kind of alarm that makes your hands shake, just a name I had never heard him mention, followed by a short text message that read, "The Whitmore transfer cleared. Same schedule next quarter." I saw it by accident. He had left his phone on the kitchen island while he went to answer the door. I was not looking through his phone. I was moving it so I could put down a bowl of pasta. I read it once, put the phone back exactly where it was, finished putting dinner on the table, ate the whole meal without saying a word about it. But I thought about it, and I am someone who, when I think about something, does not stop until I understand it. The name on the phone was Derek Whitmore. I ran it through everything reasonable first. I am not someone who jumps to conclusions. I spent 12 years in logistics, where the first rule is that you do not escalate a problem until you have verified the information twice. So I verified. I typed the name into a search engine the next morning while Marcus was in the shower. Derek Whitmore, Civil Engineering, Chicago. He existed. He had a LinkedIn profile. He ran a mid-size infrastructure development firm based in the West Loop, the kind of company that would plausibly hire a consulting engineer of Marcus's caliber. The text message made sense. A transfer between two professional contacts, a quarterly payment schedule, nothing that required explanation. I closed the browser tab. I did not mention it. That is the first thing I want you to understand about how this kind of deception works. It does not survive by being invisible. It survives by being explainable. Every single element of what Marcus was doing had a version that made complete and ordinary sense. He was a consultant. Consultants receive transfers. They work on quarterly schedules. The entire architecture of what he had built was not hidden. It was framed. Every door I might have pushed open had a sign on it that said nothing interesting here, and I was a reasonable person. So I believed the sign. Our daughter was born 12 days later. Nora Elaine Calloway arrived on February 26th at 6:47 in the morning after 19 hours of labor. She weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces. She had Marcus's brow and my chin, and a voice that the delivery nurse described as operatic. I held her and felt the particular erasure that happens in that room. Everything that had been sitting at the back of my mind for 12 days went quiet. Derek Whitmore, the transfer, the quarterly schedule, all of it dissolved completely in the specific gravity of that morning. I did not think about it again for 6 weeks. The postpartum period in our house was, by most visible measures, fine. Marcus took 2 weeks of paternity leave. He was present in the way that can be mistaken for engaged. He held Nora when I needed to sleep. He handled the grocery runs. He answered questions from family members so I didn't have to. He was performing the role of supportive husband with the same precision he brought to everything else in his life, and I was too exhausted to look at the performance and call it what it was. When you have not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 6 weeks, you are not running your critical faculties at full capacity. He knew that. I believe now that he understood it specifically. The second thing I noticed came in week 7. I was looking for our most recent tax return, the one from the previous April, because I needed the adjusted gross income figure for a student loan income verification form. We kept scanned copies in a shared drive Marcus had set up years earlier. I opened the folder. The return was there. I opened it, found the number I needed, and was about to close it when something made me pause. Our combined reported income for that year was $418,000. Marcus's W-2 showed $230,000. My salary for the 7 months I had worked before leave came to approximately $112,000. The remainder, about $76,000, was listed as Schedule C income from a sole proprietorship called Callaway Structural Solutions, LLC. I knew that LLC existed. Marcus had set it up 4 years earlier for independent consulting work, small projects, overflow from his main firm, the kind of side income that made sense for someone with his credentials. I had seen it on previous returns. It had never been a significant line. $76,000 was not a small line. I stared at it for a moment, then I thought it was a good year for consulting. The infrastructure sector was busy. Marcus mentioned that in November. He said projects were coming in faster than he could handle them alone. He had said that. I remembered the conversation. We were driving back from his mother's house in Evanston, and he said it in a tired voice, the voice of a man who was working hard and feeling the weight of it. I had squeezed his hand on the gear shift. I closed the document. I wrote down the AGI number. I submitted the form. The third thing was the credit card. By April, Nora was 2 months old, and I had returned to a version of normal life that involved leaving the house again, having conversations that weren't entirely about feeding schedules, and beginning to think about when I might go back to work. I went to a baby supply store on a Wednesday afternoon to pick up a specific type of bottle liner that had been discontinued at our usual pharmacy. I used our shared household Visa. The transaction was for $14.62. It was declined. I paid with my personal debit card, an old account from before our marriage that I had kept open out of habit and that still had a modest balance from my last paycheck. I came home and asked Marcus about it. He was on a call. He held up one finger, finished the call, came to find me in the kitchen. The credit card company flagged some transactions as potentially fraudulent, he said. I've been going back and forth with them for 2 weeks. They froze the account while they investigate. It should be cleared up by next week. He said it the way he said everything, directly with specific details, with the exact cadence of a man reporting a fact rather than constructing a story. He even showed me an email thread on his phone. I could see the subject line, Account Security Review Visa Platinum. I could see a reply from something that looked like a bank domain address. I did not ask to read the full thread. I did not ask to hold the phone. I accepted the summary in the way you accept a summary from someone you have trusted completely for 4 years, and I went back to warming up a bottle. That credit card never came back online. Over the following 6 weeks, Marcus moved us to a different card, one that was, he explained, in his name only to consolidate the pending dispute resolution. He would add me back once the fraud investigation closed. I was not worried about this. I had my own debit card. I had access to our joint checking account, which was funded every 2 weeks from a direct deposit that covered the mortgage, utilities, and what he had designated as the household operating budget. The budget was tight. I thought it was because I was not working. T was the explanation that lived in the available space, and I let it live there. What I did not know was that our household joint checking account was now the only account with my name on it. Everything else, the investment accounts, the savings accounts, the money market account I thought held our emergency fund, had been quietly, systematically restructured over the previous 8 months into accounts that were in Marcus's name alone, or in the name of Callaway Structural Solutions, LLC. He had done this while I was pregnant, while I was distracted by the physical occupation of growing a person, while my attention was exactly where it needed to be and exactly where he needed it to be. I was not careless, I was managed. May arrived, and with it came became the moment I am most ashamed of. Not because I did something wrong, but because it is the moment I came closest to the truth and chose, consciously, with full awareness that I was choosing to walk in the other direction. I was nursing Nora at 2 in the morning in her room, and I had my phone in my free hand, and I opened the banking app out of the specific insomnia that comes not from wakefulness but from low-grade dread. I looked at the joint checking balance, $4,040. The mortgage was due in 11 days. The mortgage was $3,218. $822 for 11 days of a household that included a newborn. I sat with that for a long time in the dark. Then I thought, Marcus handles the transfers. He moves money between accounts when we need it. He has always done this. There will be a transfer before the mortgage is due. I thought of the way you recite a fact you have checked before, not as reassurance but as record, and there was a transfer. 3 days later, $5,000 appeared in the joint account with a memo line that read operating transfer CSS Consulting. The mortgage cleared. The dread dissolved. I did not ask where CSS Consulting had gotten $5,000 to send us. I was still telling myself the sign on the door was accurate. Summer came the way it always does in the Chicago suburbs, fast, then suffocating. By June, Nora was sleeping in 4-hour stretches and I had started to resurface. That is the only word for it. The fog of the newborn months had begun to lift and I was becoming, again, someone who noticed things. Someone whose brain ran pattern recognition without being asked. Someone who, when a number did not add up, could not simply set it down and walk away. The first number that would not leave me alone was one I had not gone looking for. Marcus's firm held a summer gathering in late June, the kind of corporate social event that is not quite a party and not quite a meeting, held at a rooftop venue in River North with an open bar and a slideshow of completed projects. Spouses were invited. I went because Nora was 3 months old and stable enough to leave with my mother for 4 hours, and because I had been inside the house with an infant for so long that the idea of putting on actual shoes felt like a significant event. I spent most of the evening talking to the wife of a senior project manager named Glenn Parrish. Her name was Deborah. She was warm, funny, the kind of woman who gives you her full attention in a loud room, and we talked for almost an hour about the specific psychological experience of returning to a sense of self after having a baby. At some point, Marcus appeared at my elbow to introduce me to someone, and Deborah said casually, "The way you say something that is simply true. Glenn talks about Marcus all the time. He said losing him to full-time consulting was the biggest staffing hit the firm took last year." I smiled. I said something appropriate. Marcus steered us toward the other introduction, and the conversation moved on. I did not say anything to Marcus that night about what Deborah had said, but I heard it, full-time consulting. I ran it quietly against what I knew. Marcus worked for Hargrove Infrastructure Group. He had worked there for 7 years. His salary, $230,000, came from Hargrove. I had seen the W-2. I had seen it every year for 7 years. In the car on the way home, I said, carefully, "Deborah Parrish mentioned you'd moved to full-time consulting." He did not miss a beat. I reduced my hours at Hargrove at the beginning of the year, went to a fractional arrangement so I could take on more independent work. It made more financial sense. He glanced at me. "I mentioned it in January, I think. You were very pregnant. It might not have registered." I let it go, not because it was convincing, it was, but because it was possible. I had been very pregnant in January. Things had not registered, and a fractional arrangement at a firm explained the W-2 income declining without disappearing entirely. It was a clean explanation with no loose edges. 3 days later, quietly, I logged into the benefits portal I still had access to through his Hargrove employee profile. I was on his health insurance, which gave me a secondary login. I was not looking for anything specific. I told myself I was checking Nora's coverage details. His employment status showed as active full-time. I closed the portal. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment looking at the yard through the window, the slope in the grass that we had always meant to fix. He had lied about the Hargrove arrangement, that was clear. The question was why, and how far the lie went, and whether the shape of it connected to anything else I had been quietly not looking at for 5 months. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think it matters. I did not panic. I did not confront him. I did not start pulling at threads in the frantic way that makes noise and tips off the person you are investigating. I did what I had done for 12 years in a professional capacity when I suspected a discrepancy in a contract or a vendor report. I started building a quiet inventory of what I actually knew versus what I had been told. What I knew, the joint checking account had exactly one source of income, transfers from Callaway Structural Solutions, LLC. I had never seen a Hargrove direct deposit in that account. When I went back through 3 months of statements, I could not find one. I had assumed the money was coming from somewhere and that Marcus was managing the routing. I had never verified it. What I had been told, Marcus's primary income was his Hargrove salary. His consulting LLC was supplemental. The credit card situation was a fraud investigation. The tight household budget was temporary. That is 4 statements, none of which I had independently verified, all of which I had accepted because the person delivering them had never given me a reason to check. I started checking. The first thing I did was call Hargrove's main HR line from my cell phone on a Wednesday afternoon while Nora was napping. I said I was calling to verify insurance coverage for a dependent claim. The woman who answered was helpful and efficient. She pulled up the account, confirmed Nora's coverage was active, and in the course of the conversation mentioned that the primary subscriber's coverage tier had changed in March to an individual plan rather than a family plan, and that they had mailed notification to our home address. I had never seen that notification. When I got off the phone, I went through the filing cabinet in Marcus's office, something I had every right to do, something I had done dozens of times for ordinary household reasons, and I looked specifically for mail from Hargrove. I found none. I found instead, tucked into a manila folder behind a hanging file labeled miscellaneous, a stack of mail that had been opened and refolded, electric bills, a statement from a bank I did not recognize, a letter from something called Meridian Wealth Partners, addressed to Marcus personally, dated 4 months earlier. I took out the Meridian letter. I read it standing at the filing cabinet. It was a quarterly account summary. The account holder was listed as Marcus T. Callaway. The account type was a private investment account. The opening balance for that quarter was $1,412,000. The closing balance was $1,688,000. I put the letter back exactly as I found it, it. I refiled the folder. I walked out of the office, closed the door behind me, and went to check on Nora, who was still sleeping. $1,688,000 in an account I had never heard of, through a firm I had never heard of, earning returns that represented, in a single quarter, more money than I had earned in the previous 4 years combined. I did not cry. I sat on the floor next to Nora's crib, and I breathed, and I thought about what I knew and what I did not know, and what I needed to find out before I moved a single visible inch. The following 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I lived in our house, cooked dinner, nursed the baby, had conversations with my husband about ordinary things, a neighbor's fence, a recall on a brand of infant formula, whether we should repaint the front door before fall. I laughed at things. I passed him coffee. I lay next to him in bed every night and listened to him breathe and felt the specific hold of a person who has been lied to so completely that the ground under every memory is suddenly suspect. And during the days, while he was at work at Hargrove full-time, as his employment portal confirmed, I was building a file. I opened a new email account on a browser I cleared after every session. I requested through that account a copy of our joint tax returns for the previous 3 years from the IRS, something I was fully entitled to do as a joint filer. I wrote down every account number, every LLC name, every institution name I had encountered. I called Meridian Wealth Partners and said I was calling to update the mailing address on my husband's account. The woman told me she could not make changes without the account holder's authorization, but that she was happy to note the request. I thanked her and hung up. The tax returns arrived digitally 10 days later. I opened the first one 3 years prior and went immediately to the Schedule C section. Callaway Structural Solutions income for that year, $82,000. Plausible, the kind of number a successful independent consultant might earn. I opened the return from 2 years prior. Schedule C income, $91,000. I opened last year's return, the one I had reviewed myself in April. Schedule C income, $76,000. I sat with those 3 numbers for a moment, then I thought about the Meridian account, $1,412,000 at the start of a single quarter. Even at a conservative annual return of 8%, that account would need to have been seeded with well over $1 million to reach that balance. That money had come from somewhere. It had not come from an LLC reporting $76,000 in annual income. And it had not come from a W-2 salary that we had been jointly reporting for 7 years. There was a third set of books somewhere, a third financial identity, income that was not appearing on any return I had access to. I sat at the kitchen table with that understanding and felt it settle into place the way a structural diagnosis settles, not with drama, but with the specific terrible clarity of something that has been true for a long time finally becoming visible. I needed help. I could not get a loans. On a Thursday morning in late July, while Marcus was at work and Nora was in a bouncy seat on the kitchen floor, I called a family law attorney named Patricia Ose, whose name I had found through a professional referral network I trusted. I did not know yet the full shape of what I was dealing with, but I had enough. I said, I believe my husband has significant hidden assets. I don't know the full scope yet. I need to know what my options are before he knows I'm looking. Patricia Ose, I said, don't move any money, don't confront him, and don't tell anyone who might tell him, come in Friday morning. I wrote down the address, I closed the notebook, I fed Nora her 11 o'clock bottle and watched her face and thought, I am going to find every dollar. What I did not know yet was how many dollars there were to find. Patricia Ose's office was on the 41st floor of a glass building on Wacker Drive that looked out over the river. I had taken the train in because I did not want my car in a downtown parking garage with a timestamp ticket that Marcus might find. I had told him I was taking Nora to a pediatric follow-up appointment. The lie came out of my mouth clean and flat, and I did not feel guilty about it, which told me something about where I had arrived internally. Patricia was 53, small, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head, and a way of listening that made you feel like every word was being filed in exactly the right place. She had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she did not open a laptop. She wrote by hand, and she let me talk without interrupting for 22 minutes. When I finished, she said, how much do you know about the LLC? I told her what I had, the tax returns, the Meridian account letter, the employment portal discrepancy, the credit card, the refolded mail. She wrote for a moment, then she said, we need a forensic accountant before we do anything else. The LLC is the entry point. If there's income that isn't appearing on joint returns, it's either being sheltered somewhere or it's being reported on a separate filing he controls. Either way, there's a trail. There's always a trail. She referred me to a forensic accounting firm called Vantage Financial Investigations. I had an intake call with them the following Monday. By the end of that week, I had signed a retainer and handed over every document I had gathered, copies I had made quietly, at a FedEx store 2 towns over from Deerfield, paying cash. What happened next took 11 weeks. I am going to tell you what the forensic accountants found because the specifics matter. Vague summaries are how this kind of thing stays invisible. I am done keeping it vague. Marcus Thomas Callaway had, for 3 years and 2 months, been operating a second LLC registered in Delaware, a state chosen specifically because Delaware does not require public disclosure of LLC ownership. The company was called CT Meridian Consulting Group, LLC. It had a registered agent in Wilmington, a business address that was a mail forwarding service, and a single client, a private infrastructure development firm based in Dubai with a U.S. subsidiary office in Houston. That client paid CT Meridian and Consulting Group a monthly retainer of $250,000 for what the contract described as strategic infrastructure advisory services, $250,000 every month for 38 months. Total received $9,500,000. Of that amount, Marcus had moved approximately $4,200,000 into the Meridian Wealth Partners investment account. He had moved an additional $2,800,000 into 3 other private accounts, 1 in his name, 2 under the CT Meridian LLC. The remaining $2,500,000 had been spent. On what exactly was still being traced when I sat in that conference room on the 41st floor and looked at the summary page of a report that was 47 pages long and smelled like fresh toner. The forensic accountant's name was Howard Beck. He was 60, heavyset, with the specific affect of a man who has seen every variety of financial deception and reached a permanent state of unsurprise. He slid the report across the table and waited while I read the first 3 pages. Then he said quietly, "Mrs. Calloway, this has been happening for at least 3 years." I already knew that, but hearing it said aloud by a man with 47 pages of documentation behind it was different from knowing it alone in a kitchen while a baby slept down the hall. It had weight. It had the specific gravity of a thing that is now real in the world, not just real inside your own skull. I looked at the total figure on page 2 for a long moment. $9,500,000. I thought about the grout, the foam slides, the $14 bottle liner that got declined. I did not cry in that conference room. I had made a decision about that before I walked in. There would be time for everything that needed to come out of me, but it would not be in front of Howard Beck, and it would not be today. I said, "What do we do first?" Patricia filed for divorce on a Tuesday in October, the same week Nora turned 8 months old. We had spent 11 weeks preparing for that filing with the kind of thoroughness that Marcus, of all people, should have recognized, but did not because he had spent 3 years operating on the assumption that I was not paying attention. That assumption was the single largest structural error of his life. Before the filing, Patricia had worked with a financial litigation attorney named Darnell Cross to execute a series of legal preservation orders, freezing the Meridian Wealth Partners account, flagging the CT Meridian LLC accounts through the Delaware registered agent, and placing a hold on the 3 private accounts Howard's team had identified. This was done in coordination with the filing in a single morning before Marcus had any indication that anything was happening. He found out the way people find out when they have been precisely outmaneuvered, by trying to access something and finding it locked. He called me at 11:14 a.m. on that Tuesday. I was at Patricia's office. I had been there since 8. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 11:16, then at 11:22. Then he sent a text that said, "Renata, call me right now." I showed the text to Patricia. She nodded. We continued going through the asset disclosure documents. He came home that evening. I was there. We had agreed, Patricia and I, that I would be present for the initial confrontation because disappearing would have created complications with Nora's immediate custody status. I was in the kitchen when he came through the door. Nora was in her high chair with a bowl of pureed sweet potato. I had chosen this setting deliberately. I needed something ordinary in the room. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not guilt, something more like recalibration, a man running fast calculations, assessing damage, deciding on approach. "You should have talked to me," he said. That was the first thing he said, not an explanation, not a denial. "You should have talked to me," as if the problem were my communication style. I spooned another portion of sweet potato into Nora's bowl. I said, "I'm talking to you now through my attorney." "Renata, don't." One word. I did not raise my voice. I have the CT Meridian Incorporation documents. I have 38 months of transfer records. I have the Meridian Wealth Partners statements going back to the original deposit. I have Howard Beck's 47-page report. I have all of it, Marcus, every row. He was quiet for a moment that lasted a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough to do it right." He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his face in his hands. I watched him do it and I felt nothing that resembled sympathy, which is not something I am proud of, but is something I am going to tell you the truth about because this story does not benefit from me performing emotions I did not feel. What I felt was clear, the specific clarity of a person who has finally put their hands on the full shape of a thing they have been trying to see in the dark for months. He did not confess in the way confessions happen in movies, not with explanation, not with justification, not with the specific details I needed to fill the remaining gaps. What he said over the course of the next 40 minutes in that kitchen amounted to this. The Dubai client had come through a professional contact. The money had been legitimate consulting income. He had kept it separate because, and this is the part I want you to hear clearly, because he had not decided yet whether the marriage was permanent. 3 years, $250,000 a month. Nora, the kitchen floor on Valentine's Day. He had not decided yet whether the marriage was permanent. I stood up, I picked up Nora. I walked out of the kitchen and called Patricia from the back hallway and said 3 words. He just talked. The divorce took 14 months. I want to be honest about that timeline because there is a version of this story where everything resolves cleanly and quickly, where the villain is punished in a single dramatic courtroom moment and the protagonist walks out into sunlight with a check and a clean slate. That is not what happened. What happened was 14 months of depositions, asset valuations, jurisdictional arguments about the Delaware LLC, and a custody schedule that had to be rebuilt from scratch 3 separate times because Marcus's attorney kept filing procedural delays that Patricia described with professional restraint as aggressive but not unusual for this asset level. The asset level was, by final accounting, $11,240,000. Howard Beck's team had continued working through the fall and into winter, and the full picture that emerged was larger than the initial report. The $2,500,000 in spending that had been unaccounted for in the first summary was eventually traced across 4 categories. A condominium in Houston, purchased in the name of CT Meridian LLC, currently occupied by a woman named Sasha Trevelyan who had been Marcus's project liaison with a Dubai client for 2.5 years. A collection of 12 vintage architectural drawings purchased through a private dealer in New York. A boat 38 feet kept at a marina in Montrose Harbor 14 minutes from our house. And approximately $460,000 in cash withdrawals made over 30 months in amounts always just below the federal reporting threshold of $10,000. The boat, I thought about the boat for a long time. He had wanted to buy a boat in our 3rd year of marriage and I had said we should wait until the mortgage was under $150,000. He had agreed immediately without argument, and then he had gone and bought one anyway, with money I did not know existed, and kept it 14 minutes from our house for 2.5 years, and I had driven past that marina no fewer than 100 times without knowing. He had let me win the small argument. He had always intended to win the real one. The legal strategy that Patricia and Darnell Cross built over those 14 months was, in its own way, a structural achievement, the kind Marcus would have appreciated if it had not been deployed entirely against him. Because the CT Meridian income had never been disclosed on our joint tax returns, it constituted financial fraud against both the IRS and, under Illinois law, against me as a marital partner. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant that Marcus's argument that the CT Meridian income was separate property because it derived from a business he had established independently collapsed the moment Darnell demonstrated that the business had been deliberately concealed to prevent it from being classified as marital income. You cannot hide an asset for 3 years, claim it was always separate, and expect a court to honor that claim. Illinois is an equitable distribution state. The concealment itself became the argument for a larger share. The final settlement gave me 58% of all identified marital assets. That number came to $6,519,000. It arrived not as a single wire transfer but as a structured distribution. The Meridian investment account liquidated and divided. The Houston condominium sold and proceeds split according to the settlement terms. The boat auctioned through a marine broker for $214,000. The architectural drawings appraised and divided. My portion of the boat sale was $107,000. I thought about the grout again when that wire hit my account. There were consequences beyond the settlement that I think matter to tell you about, Beck. This story is not only about money. The IRS opened an audit of Marcus's CT Meridian filings in March, 14 months after the divorce filing, based on a referral that originated from the forensic accounting report. I was not a party to that proceeding. It was between Marcus and the federal government, but Patricia kept me informed of the general shape of it. The unreported income across 3 years amounted to a tax liability that the IRS calculated, with penalties and interest, at approximately $2,100,000. Marcus's personal attorney negotiated a payment arrangement. I do not know the final terms. I do not need to. The Dubai client, when the nature of the CT Meridian arrangement became visible through the divorce proceedings, terminated the consulting contract. I do not know the specifics of that termination. I know only that by the time Nora's first birthday arrived, Marcus's monthly income had returned to his Hargrove base salary, the same $230,000 he had been earning when I thought that was all there was. He is still at Hargrove, still full-time. His employment portal, which I no longer have access to, presumably still says active. Nora is 2 years old now. She has my chin and her father's precision. She lines up her blocks by size before she knocks them over, which is either adorable or ominous depending on how you look at it. We have a custody arrangement that gives me primary residential custody and Marcus alternating weekends and 1 weeknight. He shows up when he is supposed to. He pays the child support amount specified in the settlement without delay. Whatever he is in the larger story of my life, he is, so far, a consistent presence in hers, and I am choosing to leave space for that. I went back to work when Nora was 14 months old. Not to my old company. I had been gone too long and the position had been restructured. I joined a supply chain consulting firm as a senior associate, a slight step back in title from where I had been, a significant step forward in everything else. I am good at my job. I have always been good at my job. The 18 months I spent becoming an involuntary expert in forensic accounting, asset concealment, Delaware LLC structures, and equitable distribution law has made me, if anything, better at the parts of my work that involve identifying discrepancies in vendor contracts and financial reporting. I see things now that I would not have seen before. I put that in the category of things I did not ask for that I would not give back. I want to end with the thing I actually learned, because I have thought carefully about what the true lesson of this story is, and I do not want to give you a version that is easy or generic or designed to make either of us feel better than the facts warrant. The lesson is not watch your finances, though you should, and specifically you should never allow a single household member to be the exclusive manager of accounts you are both named on. The lesson is not trust your instincts, though you should do that too, and I should have done it sooner. And the moment I saw that text about the Whitmore transfer, I knew something and I chose not to know it yet. The actual lesson, the one I carry specifically from this specific experience, is this: the people who deceive us at this level are not smarter than us. They are not more capable. They are simply more willing to treat the relationship as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be honest with. Marcus did not outsmart me. He studied me. He identified the specific places where my trust was structural, where I would accept an explanation because not accepting it would have meant dismantling something I was not ready to dismantle, and he built his architecture in exactly those places. The moment I was ready to dismantle it, it took me 11 weeks. He had 3 years and $9 million and the assumption that I was not paying attention. I had a yellow legal pad, a forensic accountant, and the specific patience of a woman who spent 12 years catching billing errors. He miscalculated which one of those would hold more weight in the end.